Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Anthony Dines, introducing Alex Armlovich from the Manhattan Institute, a rising star at the Manhattan Institute, working on the new economy, Uber and all that. I know you've got lots of interest in this. Alex has proposed that he will talk for about 20 minutes and then open up a discussion. He likes to have very much a discussion type of presentation. So that's what we're going to do. I'll hand over to him straight away. Welcome, Alex, and thank you for coming.
Thanks. It's good to be here tonight. Thank you for having me. So we're here to talk about the sharing economy. And that is a little bit of a buzzword. It's kind of vague at first. So to dig in, it's defined by at least two key characteristics. It's some form of peer-to-peer community or platform that's connecting people. It's making use of underutilized resources. That's things like cars, jets, spare rooms that aren't being used to their fullest potential. It reduces waste in some manner. There's companies like NetJets, Uber, Airbnb, and Rental Runway. I don't know if anyone's ever used that for the wedding dresses. NetJets, of course, is a company that connects people who want seats on private aviation to people with private jets who want to rent them out. That's a little more higher end. I don't think I've ever personally used NetJets. But Uber, you're probably familiar with. I know you have Uber here. Airbnb, you may have used. And Rental Runway, of course, is more popular with women, but tuxedo rentals are also available there. This is also connected to generally the gig economy. The gig economy, again, another kind of buzzy term, but it's the formal arrangement of informal work, usually a job at a time, the kind of thing that's easy to do part-time. Again, this occurs frequently on web and other online platforms. Companies like TaskRabbit, Postmates. Uber itself can be gigging, or there are people who do it full-time. But has anyone here ever used Postmates or TaskRabbit, or been a TaskRabbit? Yeah, some people did. Yeah. Wonderful. So let's zoom in on a particular case study. Let's talk about Uber. All right, what does Uber do? It brings Manhattan-grade taxi service to lower density areas. That's true not just of New York City, of Chicago. It's true of medium-sized cities, and even of the outer boroughs of New York. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx did not necessarily always have great taxi service, and they would implement different regulatory strategies to try to extend cab service there. Mayor Bloomberg created something called the borough taxi, the green cab service, which is forbidden from picking people up in Manhattan south of 96th Street. It's kind of inefficient because then the cabs have to go back out of Manhattan to find more people, but it was a struggle to get cabs to pick people up in the outer boroughs. And so even in the biggest cities, Uber brings better service. The next key thing that this key company in the sharing economy does is reduce prices and make it more accessible, not just because the service area is broader, but because you can afford it. It introduces competition. It enables shared rides. That's something that's unique. In a lot of cases, taxi companies are not allowed to share rides among multiple riders. In New York City especially, I know that they're only allowed to pick up multiple riders with dispensation for a natural disaster. And so this possibility to share rides brings the possibility of reducing congestion compared to a single occupancy taxi or a private vehicle trip. And last of all, to some extent, it provides access to cheaper part-time labor and to existing resources. Again, a key feature of the sharing economy is that it's stuff that already exists that can be put to greater use. So you're a person who already has a car, you can drive for Uber, you don't have to buy a specialized taxi that's painted and has various regulatory requirements as some cities require. So taxi companies hate them, and we'll talk a little bit about that. First, let's talk about how taxi regulation works, to give some background on why they hate Uber so much. So most cities would restrict taxis in one way or another, a quantity cap on how many are allowed. Certain big cities, especially New York, use something called the Medallion System. And this is a system that requires you to carry a little plate that you actually attach to the front of the car that allows the possessor to operate the cab. Now, drivers are not always the people who own the medallion. It actually is a severable piece of property. And this is why I call it classical Marxism in one anecdote. The medallion owners rent them out to drivers despite not adding value in any direct way. It's only the government-granted privilege to operate the taxi that they're renting it out. So it's funny, Marx thought that all capital worked this way, that if you're a factory owner, you'd say, I'm going to pay you $1 more than you would earn on a farm, and I'm going to keep all the rest of it. The reason that's mistaken is that if you're earning unusually high profits or supernormal profits, the technical term for that being economic rents, there's new entry. When Apple creates a new product that it's the only provider of, like the iPhone, it starts making enormous profits doing that. Other companies see that, and Samsung is going to start a new capital equipment to come in and compete. The problem is with taxi medallions, there's no new entry. So we're able to, the medallion owner is actually extracting the labor of the driver purely just through monopoly privilege. So yeah, that's leading to why they hate them so much. Uber is breaking down that system. So in New York, medallions, the right to extract the driver's labor was worth more than $1 million each. That's where they peaked before the entry of Uber in the, I think it was 2011 or 2012. Now, there's no one actually willing to bet on the value of what that medallion is worth. It's totally illiquid, it's not trading. So we can't tell you exactly how much Uber has dented the value of that monopoly right, that government-granted monopoly right. So were they greeted as liberators? You might think that if taxi regulation is so bad. Well, by some drivers in some cities, yes. When you're a driver who doesn't own a medallion and you have to rent it from the owner, which in some cases are investors who have nothing to do with taxis otherwise, when you have to do that, you start out in the hole, say $200, and you have to earn fares to get positive for the day, and your hours are not as flexible. So those drivers, they actually did greet Uber as liberators. When New York City tried to cap the number of Ubers allowed to operate in the city, drivers came out and rallied, Uber drivers came out and said, no, this is a much better system. So it's an insider-outsider dynamic. If you're someone if you're one of those 16,000 medallion owners in New York City, you're really, really upset that what your investment that was worth $1 million has now been devalued. But if you're a driver who wants to not have your labor extracted through a government monopoly, then you're pretty happy about this. So that gives you a general outline of why taxi companies hate Uber so much. So this is driven in part by a dynamic that has been termed by a famous regulatory economist at the University of Chicago. It's called bootleggers and Baptists. This is an idea where it's basically when a bad actor wants to restrict competition in a business area and hides behind ostensibly good, socially beneficial reasons to engage in regulation of the good at hand. So in this case, it could be concerns about congestion or concerns about safety. There's a lot of debate about fingerprinting ride-sharing drivers and about other restrictions there and other stricter background checks. We should be somewhat skeptical about that for the reasons that we discussed just a moment ago with respect to the taxi medallions. They were created to limit entry into these fields and to create value to the medallion holder. And so we should always be considering, is this really a good public purpose? Is this really a necessary regulation? So when it comes to fingerprinting, maybe that is a good idea, maybe not. There are different ways to do it. There are third-party providers who do it for cheaper. You could do it through an official public means. But you always want to be asking a critical question, why is this regulation really being put forward? So the classic example here is, what do Al Capone and the Women's Christian Temperance Union have in common? And it's that back at the Prohibition era, the temperance movement was a largely religious movement, hence the Baptists. they said that we need to restrict demon rum for the promotion of general health, safety, and welfare. And there's a reasonable argument to be made. There are various social costs of alcohol, right? You can run through a model of that. But then you've got Al Capone there saying, yeah, you've got to restrict it, for the models. Like what he really wants to do is restrict the legal production and distribution of alcohol in order to then monopolize the business through organized crime. And so these are the dynamics that we always want to look at when we're considering what is the real public purpose of the regulation at hand. So that's basically a brief synopsis of one case study here with Uber. There's some other policy relevance. So it's complementary to mass transit in cities that have decent transportation systems. In the big cities that have legacy rail systems, like Chicago, Boston, and Philly, a lot of people still keep their cars, even though they have good hub-bound, downtown-bound rail systems. And the problem is, the reason they do that is because you can't rely on the subway or the elevated train to take you either across to somewhere not downtown. If you want to go across town and not just to the central business district, you can't rely on that. And if you're not traveling at 9 a.m. or 5 p.m., then the trains don't come quite as frequently. So people need their cars for those off-peak trips. Well, here comes Uber. Suddenly, you can take transit for your peak hour trips, when you're going into work and coming back from work. And if you want to go to the grocery store or the library, or you want to go to happy hour or whatever in the meantime, Uber is your safety blanket. So it has a real potential to reduce congestion of streets during the peak hour if it gets more people on transit. And it has the ability to reduce parking congestion if people are using shared rides instead of parking their own car. So I've got an example coming up of the transit map that can give you a sense of how that works. Also for multi-car families, of course, not everyone in Boston, not everyone in Chicago is going to give up their car. But if you're a family, let's say you got a car seat, you're not going to get rid of all your cars. You got little kids, you don't want to take them in an Uber, you don't want to take them on the subway. At least the second commuter in that household, say it's a Uber and a family, they can give up their commuter car and take Uber or take transit. So, and last, other smaller cities, even if you don't have a high-density transit network, it still can reduce drunk driving. I grew up outside of Buffalo, and Buffalo is the largest city to not yet have ride-sharing or ride-hailing. And there's a drunk driving issue at hand because the cabs are hard to get, no one really wants to get them. And people go down intending to not drink that much, but then of course you're a couple drinks in and not making as good of a decision. So drunk driving remains a big problem in upstate New York, and cheaper access to Uber would help with that. And again, I talk about Uber here not because of Uber in particular, the company. I'm trying to talk about the technology in general. It can be Lyft, it can be Via, any of these type of ride-hailing, ride-sharing applications. So I've kind of got a quick example. This is what Boston's subway system looks like. You can see if you're going, the laser pointer did something. Sorry about that, guys. I just had that. Right. Okay, I think that's yes. Okay, so I can't. No laser pointer. All right. Understood. All right, sorry. You can see there in Boston, if you're out, it's great access to downtown, to the central business district. And these trains come frequently, it's reliable to get to your job. It's a lot better than sitting in traffic, but a lot of people in Boston are still going to be relying on their cars for those other trips. If you need to get from over here to up into Cambridge, it's almost impossible. You have to go all the way downtown and then go all the way back out. It's really not great. Or alternatively, you have to take a bus that's going to come every 20 minutes, and it's going to stop every 2 blocks, and it's just a nightmare. So by being complementary to transit, these kind of companies are serving a useful social purpose, a useful public purpose, beyond the fact that they're just helping their customers directly. This contrasts with New York. You can actually see, well, I was hoping that would show up a little better for you, but you can see when you're in Manhattan, you got all these trains and they're all going everywhere you need. When you're in Manhattan, you never need a car. It's you can always rely on it. Even off peak, you can get around. But if you live where I live, I live in Wyckoff. Again, you can see I can get to Union Square real easy. I can get to the Lower East Side real easy. But if I want to go to Queens, I have a big problem. And I can take the L to the G and go to Long Island City. But it's a lot better. It's good for people in the outer boroughs too. So even in the biggest cities with the best transit systems, Uber serves a useful public purpose and helps with public mobility. A lot of people, in fact, in Brooklyn and Queens, about half of people out in Brooklyn and Queens do own cars. So there's potential for reduced private vehicle ownership through ride sharing. At this point, I'd like to go to questions and answers. I have some suggested Q&As. I can continue to talk about these if you like, but I'm also happy to take any particular questions you may have had. Thank you very much.
Do you have data on congestion changes or anything like that?
Right. So far in New York City, they haven't been able to prove that it has increased congestion. So that's actually, this is where we can talk a little bit about bootleggers and Baptists, about where some of the Baptists actually have an argument. In Manhattan, there is only so much street space, and so if you add 16,000 cars, that can, put a dent even in New York. But as of yet, the city did do a study and wasn't able to substantiate that Uber is the cause of slowing traffic speeds. In other cities, though, we're seeing some early evidence of households going car light, and so the lower the per capita vehicle ownership rate is, the lower we should expect congestion to get. So that's preliminary, but actually I'm planning a study on that. I want to use the American Community Survey data on vehicle ownership to get a rolling window of what the trends have been in Boston and Chicago. Again, it's only been since 2012, and those surveys are on a rolling 3-year basis, so it's tricky to get that in tight enough resolution. But does that answer your question?
Partially, I was wondering about the trade-off between the buses, perhaps.
Right.
But instead of doing that, you have 12 Ubers instead of one bus line or something.
That's right. So I actually think that there is a legitimate concern about congestion in many cities. And this should come about through, I've actually got road pricing up here. Allocating road space through the price system, it's really funny. This is a spot where strong, far left pro-city people are in favor of this, and libertarians are in favor of this. It's a funny, meeting of the minds on that. That by turning streets and parking into market goods instead of a commons, which is easily congested or overused, that we can allocate road space more efficiently. I'm actually working on a paper there's a bus-based version of these transportation network companies. There's one in San Francisco called Chariot and one in Boston called Bridge. And they use an Uber-like platform to dispatch 18-passenger minibuses. And so that's the thing, is in the long run, there's not enough space on the street for people every bus rider in Manhattan, if they all turned over to Ubers, there's not enough space on the street. But 18-passenger dispatched pop-up buses that use an Uber-pooled-like algorithm, that's the future of ride sharing in the densest center cities. So I agree with the concern, and I would say look to Chariot and Bridge to answer some of those concerns.
Can I do just real quick, in addition to Pete's, and I was going to say, you may already be aware of this. There was a study done in San Francisco that relates to drunk driving, where they looked at a couple of years before Uber and then with Uber, and on New Year's Eve there was a significant reduction in DUIs, drunk driving accidents, statistically.
That's right. Yeah,
there was a study that looked at that.
Exactly. The results in San Francisco were strongly positive.
Yeah.
So I don't know of a congestion study yet, but on drunk driving, we have strong positive evidence.
There's a question here.
Sure.
All this is very familiar to me. I actually lived in New York City for like 15 years, and I just moved. I grew up in Lakewood, but I worked in finance on Wall Street, and I work for Apple now. And I lived in Boston also.
Oh, okay. So you don't have TV.
Yeah, I'm familiar with a lot of these areas you're talking about. The Airbnb, I know has been a huge problem because, and I actually am not living in New York right now because I can't afford to live in New York. I was juggling 4 jobs after leaving Wall Street, and that also kind of
Yeah.
moves us into a discussion about the gig economy and how realistic that actually is, because it can get very exhausting.
Right.
And it sort of pushes you to retirement or death, very quickly. Believe me. It is, to constantly be having to look for new work I mean, I can tell you I do tech support for Apple, and I worked on I worked for Solomon Brothers on the sales and trading desk for one of the top equity salesman at the firm, and the head of the desk was told that you're the most organized person we've ever seen. I know I can multitask, and I was an equity research analyst and worked 80 to 100 hours a week. But I can tell you.
Yeah, just say sales and trading in the gig economy, the hours can be.
I can tell you though, like doing the multitasking that you have to do for sales and trading, and then going and working for companies where they're saying now you're going to have to be constantly learning new things all the time. You get to a point where I can tell you they're diminishing returns, because we see that at our own company. We talk about that at our own company all the time with the tech support, where you're having to support multiple parties. There's new stuff coming out all the time, and you get to the point where, like, you can't, your mind doesn't even work anymore.
Right.
And you know, I'm a fairly smart person. I went to Phillips Exeter Academy, and you know, I'm not like. These are things that I think a lot of people don't think about. I don't know if there are things you've looked into, but.
So do you want to, so Airbnb and then regulation of hours for gigging?
Well, I guess, the gig, going towards the gig economy, which is basically no one's going to have a regular job. There's going to be very few people having a regular job, and there's going to be people renting out their homes for shared, which I know has been a huge problem in New York, and they're trying to regulate that because it's taking away affordable housing. People are renting up bunches of apartments so that they're skewing the market.
Right. In terms of Airbnb, there's definitely a geographic difference in terms of where there's a necessary public purpose. In New York in particular, there's about half of the housing in New York, about half the housing stock is non-market. It's either subsidized, stabilized, or controlled, or owned, also public housing. There's about 600,000 people who live in New York's public housing system. So it's Denver. It's a whole lot of units. And New York City's average rent in public housing is $400 a month per apartment. So there's a huge gap between what you're paying and what it's worth. Not that all project housing is so nice, but there are the Chelsea houses, for example. You're right next to the High Line in public housing. And a lot of people, of course, value cash over the in-kind benefit of the housing. And so they want to turn that non-market housing into cash income through Airbnb. So there's a nested layer of debates about what do we think we should be doing with, how should we be treating the housing market, and then how does that interact with people's desire to turn that into cash? If there's interest, I mean, if we want to debate housing economics, I'm happy to do that.
I mean, I think it's a great idea concept, and I know you touched on regulation for, like, I almost took a lift over here because I didn't have a car. I had to borrow a family member's car to come. And I don't, and Lyft doesn't operate in Lakeland, but maybe Uber does. I still haven't determined that yet. Oh, it does, okay. What about Zipcar? Does Zipcar operate here?
No. Okay. So has anyone used Zipcar before? Zipcar, you familiar? Yeah, it's a shared ownership model. You subscribe to the service and you're able to rent out a car on an hourly basis. There's also Car2Go. Car2Go is another one that's only in certain cities. It's a subsidiary of Mercedes-Benz, and you pay, they even have a minute rate. So you only pay while the vehicle's outside of its home area. In New York, that's basically within Brooklyn and Queens. You can drive along and drop it off wherever it is, and wherever it's parked is its home, whereas Zipcar has fixed stations that you have to return them to.
Yeah, I think something like, Zipcar would do well in a community like this, but I guess, I don't know how much traffic Lyft gets, because a lot of people here, you almost need to own cars unless you're on a college campus, I guess.
Certainly. Well, I appreciate your question very much. Why don't I come back to you and we'll do some more questions.
Yeah, I'm going to talk to you more. I'm very fascinated with what you've been working on.
right, thanks very much.
Yeah, with that.
As far as, so NetJets works the same way, you can lease like a jet and then use it. Do you see that as more like less competition within that than a company like we're like breaking into that country?
Yeah, I think the natural market size is a little smaller for private aviation than for.
Do you see that taking off in the future as like for startups, or do you think it'd be more of like a, like Berkshire Hathaway helps out with NetJets, do you think it'd be more of like a big company run sort of thing?
I imagine, I mean, I think there's also a startup that's working on, I think, or let me think, I think Uber has a helicopter vertical that they're testing. I don't know if that's still live. So maybe, maybe between private aviation and helicopters, there's enough room for more than one large service provider. But it's just that the barrier to owning a private jet is so high that there's a decent incentive for people who really want that extra luxury to be willing to find empty seats. Like there's a lot of value to be captured there from matching people. So I think it's a viable business. I don't know if it's gonna change the way we fly, but I think it's a valuable niche product. Absolutely.
So, sorry, someone comment real quick. You talked quickly about how there's certain like there's now like a jet rental Uber essentially.
Right.
Do you think that something like that, as it grows and as that sort of niche within the gig economy expands, do you think that that has the potential to sort of overcome the traditional airline travel that we have now, or do you see airlines being around for the long time?
It's I think large traditional carriers will definitely continue to exist, but as an alternative to first class travel, basically if you're considering first class, then private aviation through something like NetJets is not totally out of the question. But I don't think it'll replace coach, mass market coach. It's just the nature of, if you're flying in a Gulfstream, it's a luxury product.
Right.
Yeah.
So you don't think it'll ever grow to the point where like you're renting out for like a large, like a 737 or something like that, because the barrier is going to be too high?
Well, I never want to say never,
Right.
Because entrepreneurship is unpredictable. But I think I imagine it's possible. But yeah, chartering. It's certainly possible that people could charter flights more broadly. Sure.
I was wondering, you have Airbnb up there. I was wondering if you've possibly done or how extensive your research has been in Airbnb, and whether or not you've seen side effects from upset hotel companies such as taxi services and whatnot. Because I've stayed in Airbnbs and they're a lot cheaper and they're pretty much just as nice for the most part.
Right. That's also been my experience. I like Airbnb. There are, I understand the concern that some people have that Airbnb doesn't always collect hotel taxes in cities that they don't have a formal agreement with. And I think that that's something that you do want a level playing field in that sense. But otherwise, absolutely, it's cheaper, it's using underutilized space. And with very few exceptions, it's not going to swamp the housing market in an area. In New York, it interacts with the subsidized housing stock in a way where you can be asking, should we have half the housing stock be subsidized? Maybe that's, it depends on which way you want to go on that question. Another particular example would be Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. The population of that city is so small compared to the global tourism demand from there that I understand that people are concerned about the nature of the identity of their city, and that there might be some compelling public purpose in terms of designating where the mass commercial uses is going to be. You get because of the almost 24-hour day that Iceland gets, they have a really intense nightclub culture during that. And so I understand, like, if you're trying to, if every residential neighborhood in Reykjavik turns into, is getting Airbnb and everyone's just on ecstasy running around all night, through the permanent day, it also, I understand why, there's a compelling public purpose there, but that's a unique exception. For the most part, for most cities and most neighborhoods, Airbnb is just the opportunity for mobile people to have a mobile business and provide a good service and have an insurance umbrella. I mean, my great-grandmother in Middletown, Ohio, was an Armco steel town. She took on boarders to help pay the mortgage, the depression was difficult. So taking on boarders is an old thing, and it's a totally fine and healthy thing. And so in the same way that I think taking on boarders traditionally is not a problem, I think the vast majority of areas, Airbnb, there's not a compelling public purpose to restricting them.
When I see you have driverless cars on your list, and when I think of driverless cars, I think that encourages longer commutes, suburban sprawl, congestion, negative environmental impact. What has your research found about the sharing economy? Is that for driverless cars a player?
Right. Well, it certainly does. It certainly is. It certainly is relevant because in the long run, Uber and its competitors are hoping to have a driverless fleet. Imagine a driverless Uber zip car is the model. So it's like you subscribe to a fleet and you call it like an Uber, and you don't have your own private vehicle. So that would come first to the densest areas and to the first-ring suburbs of dense cities, cab-like shared driverless vehicles. The interesting thing is driverless cars are kind of a hybrid. They can be both a kind of rapid transit and a type of commuter rail. So commuter rail encourages sprawl, right? Think Metro North or New Jersey Transit, or Metra in Chicago, or Caltrain in San Fran. All those services enable you to be very far away and commute conveniently to the central business district. And also, while you're on Metro North, one of my coworkers commutes 2 hours from Connecticut to Transit every day. And the reason that he does that is because he wants a Connecticut lifestyle, but then is able to work on the train that whole time. And so driverless cars are going to bring Metro North to everyone, and not just along one train line, it's everywhere. So it depends on if people choose to live down, it depends on the balance of people's preferences. So if you want to move out and use it like Metro North, you can do that. If you want to move in, let's say it's Columbus and you don't have a great transit system, but it's relatively compactly developed in the core, Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio supply infill developed its parking lots and have people be able to live a car-free lifestyle in these autonomous taxis. So it depends on the balance of people's preferences. Right now, we don't know. The dust hasn't even been kicked up yet, so we don't know how it's going to settle.
I would expect a lot more environmental opposition.
Right. That's what.
They're the same people that are supporting some of the companies that are sponsoring it. So it's like your bootleggers and bastards.
Right. Exactly. It's always a dynamic that you want to watch, and it's going to vary by area. So public policy will, in part, determine the balance of how this works out. Cities, if it's Portland, for example, has an urban growth boundary. So ex-urban growth is already limited. If you have an urban growth boundary and congestion pricing on this, and you introduce road pricing, then that compact infill model is almost all that's going to be possible. If you don't do road pricing at all, then that would be interesting. I think we're going to see different results in different areas. I think Houston will continue to be mega sprawl, and I think the coastal cities will do more infill. Yeah.
Now, can you explain the term urban growth boundary?
Right. An urban growth boundary is a limit on the issuing of building permits outside of a certain area. So Oregon has state level control over development policy, and they're able to restrict growth on the periphery in order to encourage compact infill development. Is that,
Sort of more elaborate zoning schemes.
Exactly. It's metropolitan area zoning. The strictest form of an urban growth boundary is actually, they call it a green belt. So in London, there's this giant area that surrounds the outside of the city that is just total. You can camp on it, But it's not by market forces. It's by, they just said you're not allowed to build anything on it.
Just to try this right, you said that they no longer place a value on the Medallion for taxi companies.
Right, I can't tell you what the market value of it is because it's completely illiquid. It's not trading. It hasn't been traded since Uber entered.
So if you were looking for some reason to get into the taxi business, you wouldn't be able to.
You'd have to buy them, you'd have to find a seller.
So you'd have to
They haven't
figure out
publicly
that.
reported any prices, in other words, yeah. Yeah, it's difficult to value it right now because no one knows exactly how things are going to settle out with Uber, Lyft, via Get, all these different ride sharing.
I read something somewhere where they were actually, Uber was having to subsidize, I guess, their drivers.
Right. So that's another thing. Uber has been spending very intensely on its spending very intensely on its expansion, and so in some mature markets they are they're making money on an operating basis at least. But the enormous amount that it's a chicken and egg problem every time you enter a city. If you want people to take an Uber, there have to be cars. If you want people to drive, there have to be people who want to take an Uber. So you've got to subsidize everyone at the start. You've got to give massive sign-up bonuses to drivers and massive sign-up bonuses, lots of free rides to new riders to try to get those plates spinning, and, to try to get everything working. So that expansion right now is really dragging on them.
Is that happening in Manhattan, do you know? Do you know what markets they're having to do that? I know they had to pull out of China because they couldn't.
That's right. Didi Shuxing, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, Apple did some sort of.
Yeah, they partnered, they had investors who were investing in both, and they brokered a deal between the two for Uber to leave China. I'm sorry for I'm using Uber as a shorthand for ride hailing. I'm actually the biggest fan of the Chariot and Lyft, the bus-based ones, because I think that it answers every possible public policy question about them in the densest areas. Because I think in suburban areas, there's no concern about congestion. Everyone owns a car, everyone drives, so if you can get some people to give up their car, it's a net win no matter what. So there's not really much of a public policy question in a suburban area. But in the densest areas, yeah, I'm a big booster of these bus-based versions of them. And I think in the long run, Uber will probably introduce some larger occupancy vehicle thing to serve those markets. Because there's just not enough space on the street. I've had people ask me before if Uber is going to replace the New York City subway. And I'm like, it's 5 million riders a day. You can't. You have to pile the cars on top of you. It's just, even the 18-passenger minibuses, you can't. So, like in the densest areas that have successful rail systems, you're going to have rail be a part of that. But actually, one other public policy application of ride sharing, the areas who have light rail systems that don't have great ridership. So like Dallas has DART. They have these trains that come every 20 minutes, and they, don't really go very extensively. They're almost like commuter rail, but using light rail vehicles. Ride sharing is going to help bail that out a little bit in terms of riding. At least that's my bet. I think people will be willing to take Uber to one of those trains if the frequencies are decent. So again, the fact that it's complementary to transit in these areas is going to make those stub lines of light rail more useful. Because otherwise, the last mile problem, you're not going to walk 2 miles to a light rail. Half mile, fine, but not 2 miles.
Okay, so I know you said that Uber benefits their customers directly most of the time. Now, by your research, how do Uber benefits their actual drivers? I know quite a few Uber drivers, and they haven't lasted that long working as Uber drivers, maybe a couple of months, 3 months. They say, sometimes the cost of repairing the car, tires, gas, etc.
Right.
And they do live in areas where there's a lot of people. How do you think companies like Uber they are looking towards benefiting more their actual drivers or people that work for them, or?
I think in the cities with Medallion systems, you can say that Uber is unconditionally an improvement over the Medallion system, where you've got this person who has the government monopoly renting you out the right to operate your business. In those areas, it's unconditionally an improvement for drivers. But otherwise, I think in the long run, especially once gas prices start rising again, if and when they start rising, I realize that's another question. They're going to have to raise the reimbursements, like you said, in order to cover the cost of the increased operating costs. So I think Uber is constantly going to have to offer drivers enough to keep drivers on the road. Because Uber understands drivers are the backbone of its system. And So that's competitive. Actually think that's one benefit is that all these services are increasing competition at the bottom of the labor market for workers who are most vulnerable and potentially have the least. Say you're a high school graduate or a high school dropout, you can still drive. So by adding to demand for labor for high school graduates or high school dropouts, that's going to, in the long run, be healthy for them. It's going to raise wages in the long run. So that's the hope, but I think it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. It's definitely worth keeping an eye on.
Sure. I'm curious about, think about this thing with these drivers. Like in the trucking industry, it's sort of a sensible regulation. You got this sort of the 10-hour rule, what have you, or airline people.
Right.
What's happening in this area? Is there anything happening in that regard?
Yeah, some cities are looking to limit the amount of cruising time. And there's a debate about, do you have to limit the amount that a person is in the car or the amount that they're on the road, or like, I think New York is considering limits along these lines. It's not totally unreasonable to have hours limits, but again, we always want to look at the public purpose and what are the hours limits being proposed. And yeah, because I'll tell you what, the Medallion owners are always looking for a way to edge those guys out. If you limited drivers to 12 hours of driving a day, I don't think anyone would have a problem with that necessarily.
Yeah. Well, think about this woman next to me was talking about too, the stressors on the people. But okay, well now this popping pills and I'm going 20 hours
Yeah.
my Uber number.
Right.
That's not a good thing for anybody.
Certainly not. So yeah, that's the thing is these companies do have a strong incentive to do great background checks, because if you have like sex criminals driving people around and committing crimes, that's really, really bad for your brand, and people are not going to ride your thing. So like Uber has a very strong interest in regulating its own drivers. In fact, some people, it's funny, these criticisms can go both ways. I've actually had people say that Uber too easily kicks out its drivers. I'm trying to remember what the latest decimal point is where they cancel, you're not allowed to drive for Uber if your rating falls. I'm trying to remember what it is exactly. It's surprisingly high though. It's above more than 4 stars. It's a really high threshold that if you fall below 4-point-something stars, you can't drive anymore. So they do keep an eye on driver ratings very closely. That's a good thing.
Yeah, I know in Canada there was an issue with Uber drivers not paying taxes and declaring income. Is there such a problem here in the US? They had to suspend the Uber in Canada for a couple months too.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, Montreal has had interesting.
Yeah, in Montreal.
Montreal is a very militant taxi industry.
What?
Yeah, that's a very militant taxi industry. But it's that French fighting spirit. In terms of withholding, I think Uber's tax compliance hasn't been a problem in the United States. I'm actually not super familiar with what Canada's equivalent of the 1099 is, but for whatever withholding is necessary, I'm sure everyone agrees that you should have ordinary taxation of labor income consistent with any other business.
Following what Professor Tracy said, I know in the news we've seen some assaults involving like the services of Airbnb. Do you see any safety regulations coming that way, and if so, how do you think that will impact the economy?
Well, I think in terms of safety regulations, I don't know exactly what. I would have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Airbnb depends in large part on its connection to a social media profile and to existing reviews. And so if someone puts up an ad and they didn't connect it to their Facebook and no one's ever been in the apartment, generally you'd be like, well, maybe I'm not gonna go with that. But I don't to date know of a particular safety law that I would propose to be passed for Airbnb that ordinary prudence doesn't already account for. I'll say one thing on driver safety for ride sharing. The fact that you and your driver both have GPS, both of your phones are constantly tracking your location while your ride is active, that's the ultimate safety thing. Like, I'd much rather have my location be known at all times while I'm in motion than just be like, oh, New York City said that this guy got fingerprinted, but otherwise no one will ever know where I am. Like, I'll trust an Uber driver even over, I actually trust everybody, but I would still trust an Uber driver over a cab, just a hair amount because of that fact.
Just get in and you get out.
Yeah, it's like,
If no one else, I'll jump in with another question. I was reading, I guess it was a week or two ago, about some issues in San Francisco, there might be some of this in New York as well, where people in certain parts of the cities were starting to complain about Airbnb because people were turning in traditional rental apartments. They were not evicting, but eventually not renewing leases of people because they could turn around and they could essentially lease it through Airbnb and make much more money that way. So there was starting to be some discontent in San Francisco, possibly New York, of the impact of Airbnb on some of these neighborhoods.
Right.
Is that, I mean, what have you run across in your work?
So this is an interesting thing where when tight regulation of the housing supply pushes rental and condo prices above the marginal cost of construction, it is a really serious public policy issue. But I always say, why are you zoning so tightly, rather than saying, why are you worried about this being used? If you want to have an extremely exclusive, extremely expensive city that does not allow the housing supply to grow, then, if you're willing to bite that bullet, or if that's what the voters of that city are insisting that their city council do, then I'm not sure of a way around it. That Airbnb needs to allow non-hotel operations. So in other words, if you're renting out just, like, boarding should always be allowed. Boarding is a tradition that's existed for, indefinitely. Ben Franklin, like all the founding fathers, when they, came to the Constitutional Convention, stayed in boarding houses. Like it's totally consistent with the tradition and history of, the United States. It's not revolutionary. So allowing boarding, it should always be allowed as a right. But converting to full hotel use in questionable violation of what the zoning is, I'll defer to the rule of law on that and say maybe you do need to restrict full hotel use. But allowing a small business on a boarding basis, I think that should always be allowed. But again, I always go back to zoning. Why is San Francisco not letting you build anything and causing it to be this zero-sum battle? Oh, we only have this many units, what are we going to use this small number of units for? That's what I would bring it back to.
It's these disruptive type shared economy companies they're a huge paradox, because, you have to consider too, I know you were saying back in the day, but the population was also a lot less than it is now. We're over 300 million people in this country. We bring in a lot of people, workers on H-1B visas. I know my company takes very good use of that, and we see that all the time, not just in Silicon Valley.
Right.
But I guess the concern, the hotel industry's been hit in New York, which is a good thing because it's cost fortunes in New York hotels.
Right.
I lived in an apartment when I first moved to New York, which I wish they'd bring back the SROs.
Yeah.
Because that would be wonderful. They were affordable, but there was a mad rush.
You were around in their SROs?
I was living in the Belnord, it became the Belnord Hotel off of Broadway, 87th Street.
Yeah.
My own little apartment with a shared bathroom on the hall, working on Wall Street 80 to 100 hours a week, yes. So, yeah. Thank you, Sanford Weil. But yeah, I wish they'd bring this back. I mean, I think that would be great. I think Airbnb is enabling people to be able to afford to stay in the city and rent out their apartments so that they can subsidize their income so they can afford to stay there. And I do think it's a good thing, but when it has to be regulated in some way, simply because, I was living in a couple different apartment buildings before I moved back to Florida, and they're having a big problem with globalization where you have communities coming in from overseas and they're moving 16 people into one-bedroom apartments.
Right.
So the landlords are more than happy, to keep the rents at a certain level because it's getting skewed because they can divvy up the rents between 16 people versus one family having to pay whatever they're asking.
Right.
So I don't know if that's something that you look at too, and look at the whole housing dynamic with the disruptive shared economy.
Right. In the tightest housing markets, I'm fine with the city saying you have to live in your apartment a majority of the days of the year. That's the kind of, that otherwise you're fully converting it into a hotel. I still think that you should do something on the zoning side, like why, if you have a housing scarcity problem, then housing abundance is the answer, not trying to get rid of other competing uses within the housing stock. You do that. But contingent on it already being a housing crisis, a housing crisis, I mean, a very, very tight housing market, very, very low vacancy rates, then I'm comfortable with them only allowing boarding and not renting out your apartment 365 days a year. I also think it's important that for multifamily buildings, it's regulated by the owner, by the building owner. I do think it's important for Airbnb to allow data sharing with the building owner because the closer you are to other people, the more your actions affect one another. So the negative externalities is the formal term. If you're bothering your neighbor, that is potentially bad for the building. If you're having constantly bachelorette parties coming and staying in your Airbnb, you're not filtering your Airbnb guests appropriately. If you start causing a problem for your neighbors, they need to be able to address that through the landlord. So at the building level, I have no problem if a multifamily building wants to say, hey, this is a quiet area, we've got families in here, we don't want to have transient guests coming in. So allowing building by building that private regulation to happen, I think, is an important dynamic for preserving peace in a building.
The other issue you have in New York is it's become a parking lot for global capital. So.
Right. And again, we can talk about how capital inflows interact with land use regulations, but certainly.
I was going to say, we have a couple more minutes, and I guess I was going to ask, you talked about Airbnb, you talked about Uber. Are there any kind of new types of industries on the horizon that are using this sharing, kind of part of the sharing economy? Are there new things out there that we may not have heard of, or you kind of covered them all?
Let's see. I think I don't know if people think of Rent the Runway as a sharing economy company, but it is a great one. Those one-off dress rentals. I'm sure anyone who's had to get a dress for a wedding and wants to get a really nice one, but doesn't want to pay $5,000 for it. So maybe that's one that's underrated as a sharing economy one. It's not always thought of that way. NetJets is another one that's relatively obscure, as we saw it. But other sharing models, I think I mentioned Car2Go. I think that's a really neat one where it's like Zipcar, but the stations are everywhere. It's just street parking. And so it allows you to both have a car and kind of not have a car. And again, it has that transit complementarity. Maybe you only need a car once a week. A lot of people will keep a car if they need to use it once a week. But if you can pick up one of these on street parking, go to the grocery store, that's something you might not want to take all your groceries on the subway. But yeah.
Just one example. There are a couple of websites, Rover and Dog Vacay, where you can board your pet in somebody's private home. That's a new.
That's a good one.
This is not such a new problem. There are churches that have for decades been renting out their space during the week to schools that rent out unused space to other organizations in the evening. So is it more the technology? Is it that it's more personal?
Exactly. That's a great thing. That's a great thing to end on. The best sign of a successful sharing economy area or company, sector or company, is that it's not as revolutionary as it appears at first. Airbnb, boarding has been around since my great grandma. Black car services existed before Uber. Tuxedo rentals existed before Rent the Runway. But all of the transactions costs of these things have been brought down, like the hassle of doing it. So in New York, people always did short-term rentals when they went on vacation. Like, I'm going to be out for a month. My rent is $3,000. I don't want to lose $3,000. I'm going to rent this place out. Whereas maybe Grand Rapids, Michigan or something, people would be like, well, I'll take the hit for the month. It's a huge hassle to find someone for that short a time. And, Airbnb makes it really easy. You go, oh, well, I've already got a marketing platform. I've already got an insurance umbrella. I'm going to be able to find someone to take my Grand Rapids apartment for a month. So reducing the hassle expands the access to it beyond the highest pressure markets for what already existed. So that's absolutely right. In a lot of ways, these are just bringing things that existed to a broader market.
Any final questions? Okay, thank you very much for. Do keep an eye on the website for our next speaker and these. If you
Yeah,
could,
so if you could,
yes.
take this with you, and give us your feedback, and this as well, you can fill out this